have you in this learning space together. I like to call it adaptive leadership. We're building this container for the next about 90 minutes. And so we want to just, as Andrew said, share with you a little background of the course, a little bit of our theory of change and the thesis we designed for this, and how we kind of think about ourselves in the food space, but with this overarching idea that projects and how we manage projects are largely glued together with this idea of leadership, adaptive leadership specifically, and what that looks like with the mindset we are building meaningful projects for generational impact and change. And Clea said something on our last gathering, and I really appreciate it, that in order to hold a mindset that we are doing work that contributes to generational change, whilst holding the reality that this happens in 3 to 5 year increments. And so, with that, I'm Tina Kahn. I'm coming into you today from Wichita, Kansas. I reside in rural Kansas, a community of 780 people with gravel roads and one stop sign called Cottonwood Falls. And I'm a community developer, practitioner of leadership. So, I've worked with CLIA many years, had a lot of great experiences about a decade ago developing our Healthy Food Access CDFI, our HFFI funding for the state of Kansas. I will say from my heart to yours, she's one of the most skilled researchers I've ever worked with in the country. So with that, I'll turn it over to my friend and colleague, Kalia.
All right, thanks, Tina. That feels like pressure, but thank you. I appreciate
You
it.
are.
Hey, everybody. My name is Kalia Souza, pronoun she, her, and I am a health equity advocacy consultant, also local and regional food systems development. Like Tina said, she and I met a little over 10 years ago, working together at Kansas State University Center for Engagement and Community Development. I've also worked with Michigan State University Center for Regional Food Systems on food policy organizing, leadership capacity development, been in food systems work for overall about a decade or so. But I always think of food systems as a tool for community development overall. It's just one way in which we approach the work because everything is so interconnected across our systems. So with that little bit of an introduction, let's get you into an introduction of the course. Why this? Why now? So as Andrew said, we just came off of a 3-week course intensive for integrating adaptive leadership into project management. And it is definitely timely. We all know we are in politically unprecedented and unpredictable times, which is in turn affecting our funding streams. And when those things we rely on are no longer reliable, we have no choice but to adapt. But in times like these, it really brings to bear the question of how reliable our systems ever were to begin with, and to what extent we need to dismantle, redesign, and build anew. So everything that you see here on this slide, that's what it's about, and establish the premise for our course design. Next slide. So based on that premise, we were considering how our work connects now and beyond to create generational change and impact, just as Tina was starting us off with. Next slide. So let's start here. This is how we usually approach project management, first dealing with the components of. We have a purpose, a plan, and procedures that we follow. Purpose is the why, the North Star or compass guiding the change we need to bring about through our projects. The plan encompasses what we think is needed to achieve the project outcomes that would reflect that change. And we utilize all sorts of processes and frameworks to develop the project scope, the goals, the objectives, and deliverables. And then the procedure is how we translate all of that into action using the tools and resources available to us. So our why, what, and how is encompassed in these areas of project management. Next slide. But the actual management part comes in with the curveball. So that's when we're looking at the sociocultural and the sociopolitical climate we have to navigate, which in turn informs our why, what, and how. Next slide. But really, what we were establishing is that we need to go beyond project management to cultivate a project leadership ecosystem. And this is where we recognize time and honestly the human condition intersecting the work, capital W. That's getting into our generational component. There is a management aspect to all of that, of course, but only encompassed within and secondary to a generational perspective that has us looking at the past, the present, and future of the work all at once. So we need to exercise adaptive leadership to meet the moment and to move the moment. We need to design an appropriate environment, or as Tina said earlier, container for that seed to thrive in. Next slide.
Yeah.
So that's the groundwork we're laying to get you all started in this container that you've created here in the community of practice. And we're going to send you into short breakout rooms with that and ask you all to get to know one another with these questions we posed in the first session of the course. And I'm going to drop those in the chat before we send you into breakouts for about the next
10
8-ish
minutes.
minutes.
Yep.
10? Yep,
Yeah.
even
I
better.
think we've
So
got time. Yeah.
here are those questions. So let's get warmed up. Andrew, whenever you're ready, we can send folks on in. Okay, so before I go over this, just a little bit about each of these sessions. We did have a cadence to each of the sessions of the course where we grounded everyone in the rationale for the course, just like we did at the top of this community of practice, the why this, why now. Then we prepped everyone with the session competencies, which is what you're seeing here. And we spent a significant amount of time, as Andrew said, first session was 4 hours, the next two sessions were 3 hours each, but we spent a significant amount of time in kind of a teach and practice mode. And then we wrapped up with a snapshot of all the tools, resources, processes, and exercises that we introduced in the session, and spent some time in reflection at the end with open discussion and session evaluation. So if you do end up going into the link that Andrew's going to provide later, you will see towards the end of each session multiple links to multiple tools that we shared that are in a shared Google Drive folder for all of you to access. But starting off with session number 1 here, another thing to know is that each session of the course was designed to build from the previous session and then build toward the next. And we did acknowledge that the course could have easily been a deep year-long co-learning experience. And we tried to make sure that we were introducing the project management components and concepts, and then follow up with the corresponding adaptive leadership tools. So session 1 actually ended up being a 2-in-1 session about creating the project blueprint and anticipating challenges. So part 1 was very foundational, focusing on the building blocks of project development, including breaking down the issue you're working on to develop the appropriate approach. And part 2 overall focused on, the mess of project management, or so to speak, those overarching systemic influences and how to navigate both the internal and external conflict it brings. Tina, what do you have to share about the adaptive leadership components of each of these parts?
Yeah, Clea said this first one was kind of foundational, but it was in two parts, and this was kind of setting the premise. This was our architectural looking at the blueprint, as you see there, of what this means to go forth into project management and the mindset. And going back up to our thesis of purpose, plan, and the how, what, and why, purpose, plan, and process. Often projects are designed and sought out in those three buckets. And so this idea of adaptive leadership, providing the glue around it, is kind of what set us underneath this first session. So to say there's project management components, very technical in those three buckets. There's adaptive leadership that comes underneath that to hold it together, and that's going to really understand the technical and adaptive pieces, holding to some purpose, and the ability to raise the heat to get others in the production zone. Primarily in project work, and as you all are very well aware of, we're dealing with groups of stakeholders. We're dealing with others. We're dealing with those in funding. We're dealing with those in communities. We're dealing with those in education and in various other institutions. And so the ability to hold the purpose and raise the heat for engagement is a tool we call the productive zone. It's a zone of disequilibrium. So there were some adaptive leadership things, as I said, glue together your projects and the technical pieces of leading a project in project management. One of them right there, technical and adaptive, we're going to get into and give you that tool today. So we're going to do an activity with it. We're going to give you that tool. For those of you not in the course, it's an easy takeaway that can kind of give you some momentum with some of your stakeholders and project management group right from tomorrow. You can start using it.
Okay, thanks, Tina. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, here we are. So going back to the idea of each session building upon the previous session and building into the next, part two of session one really was almost like an introduction to going into a deeper dive in session two, where we focused on building support for the project. So that last piece from the previous session about anticipating challenges, a lot of that is coming around the kind of relationships that we hold in trying to get the project done. So we really try to, in session two, go deeper into the interrelational aspects of project management, focusing on team and organizational values and communication, and then how that connects to communications and engagement with partners and underrepresented voices in order to build out your communications and engagement plans. And of course, there are a lot of adaptive leadership concepts, skills, and tools underlying all of that, which Tina will talk about a little bit.
Yeah, one we majorly touched on was this idea of our comfort zone bandwidth in the ability to get used to uncertainty and conflict in relation to some projects and where we're going in some unprecedented funding times and political times. But a huge tool in adaptive leadership is this idea of faction mapping. And that is essentially our communication with those groups of stakeholders and how we prioritize whom to do the work with, who needs to do the work, who's engaged in the work, understanding what binds them together. And so there's a huge tool in adaptive leadership with identifying your target audiences through what's called a faction map. And we did some with that. And I'm excited we've got set up this next section of this community of practice for those of you that were in the course to be able to talk and share about some of these tools with others. And faction mapping was one that had some momentum in relation to communication. So I think this was a really big one to take away.
Yeah, and speaking of that, I'll speak just a little bit to something that connects to that conflict transformation strategies over here on the project management side. So one of the tools that we introduced was something called the TRIP model, which essentially gets you to better diagnose what kind of conflict you're in with another person. So the TRIP model is figuring out, is that a topic related conflict? Is it a relational conflict that we're in? Is it an identity-based conflict that we're in, or is it a process-based conflict? Because sometimes in conflict, we will identify it as something that's topic-based, but really what's underlying it is something that is identity or relational-based. So if you're trying to make progress in your project and you hit a road bump, but you two aren't speaking the same language about what the problem actually is, the TRIP model helps you to figure out what is it we're actually saying to each other and need to address. So let's go to session 3 overview. So session 3 built off of that and went into strategic communications. You know, if you take something like the conflict model and faction mapping to figure out who you're talking to when and about what and what might be some of those challenges, then strategic communication says, all right, well, how do I need to talk through this with someone to move our project forward? But it really was getting into this strategic communications and relationship development as a proxy for valuing our time differently and how we sustain the work differently. And that set us up for getting into some concepts around change management and some
Mhm.
models and tools around that. And there's some connection to some adaptive leadership concepts of loss, uncertainty, et cetera. But we ended the session with thinking about how do we redefine success for evaluation purposes and developing more meaningful metrics that align with this generational perspective in the work, even though, as Tina pointed out earlier from one of our previous sessions, we're often working in those 3 to 5 year grant cycles to try to get to 20 or 30-year long change. And asking powerful questions is a part of evaluation and something that Tina will speak more to in terms of the adaptive leadership concepts. Tina?
Yeah, so ending out this course, folks, a huge component of adaptive leadership is our ability to manage self, but that is, i.e., take care of ourselves and hard work, exercising leadership, mobilizing others, making progress, expanding our bandwidth. It's a space where we have to be intentional to take care of ourselves because we're stepping into change management, as Clea said in session 2, some conflict management. What type of conflict are we encountering? But we are all in the space of managing and navigating change by way of our works, our projects, technical things, but we're on the edges of pushing change forward. We're change agents. And there is loss to that. There is magnitude of stakeholders experiencing loss. And speaking to that, we had a couple of tools, our vulnerability in those spaces. So we had one tool in adaptive leadership, this idea of asking powerful question, what goes into a powerful question. But the glue of this session was really the ability to manage self and take care of self, which is not to be undervalued in our work. And so I really want to hold space that taking care of ourselves is prime importance, I would say. Yeah. Anything else, Clea? Closing out the sessions?
Yeah, maybe I'll just leave off with one more thing around evaluation. We did present the equitable evaluation framework,
Yep.
and some of you may be familiar with that, maybe have incorporated it into your work. It comes from philanthropy, but it really does start to take into consideration very intentionally the practice of equity in evaluation. So a lot of times, it's easier to talk about equity than it is to actually put it in practice, let alone evaluation, which a lot of times ends up being something of an afterthought or something that if we have enough money, we'll do it, and can oftentimes feel like, oh, I really need a lot of expertise to do that. But with that idea of redefining what we mean by success, centering everything on relationships and that human dignity component and generational perspective, that equitable evaluation framework helps to develop your project evaluation from that angle. And it doesn't always have to be as complicated as we make it, even though we know we are operating within complex systems. So everything about centering relationship. That's it. Let's go on to our next
Yeah.
slide where Tina is going to walk
Yeah.
all of you through some discussion about the course experience to start off with.
Yeah. So we wanted to make sure a big part of this community of practice space was for just conversation and us to have some ideas, sharing, talking, and largely from you all that were in the course. A great artifact. Thank you, Andrew, from My Heart to Yours. Andrew captured the course sessions incredibly. He has got the Google Doc with all the resources and tools and links in it that you can access. So if you have the time and it permits with your team, go through the courses, spend some time on the YouTube channels to watch those courses, and then hop into that shared drive. All of the resources are there for you. So thank you, Andrew, for doing that. But I'm going to get on the balcony as we learned in the session, and I just want to see what's going on in the lay of the land with you all from this course, what stuck with you, what resonated with you, where have you found some traction, and I'm just going to kind of guide the discussion here. So as we build out this food leadership ecosystem, if you're with us and you joined in this experience, what unique things um, did you experience or learn or jump into that applies to your work? And how is it applied? So, if you'd like to share, would love you to come off mute and just start visiting.
I really took home that faction mapping because it helped me look at many different sides of the factions that we're dealing with. Because it was easy to go, I know them, that little puka and all that, but we didn't really look at how deep some of the stuff goes, and especially looking at how we might not be communicating adequately to our different factions.
Yeah, Carrie, would you hang out with us a little bit on that? Share a little bit more about this idea of factions. And you said we went deeper with them. What do you mean by that?
Well, when you have to go and look at what are things that would create um, dissonance with each faction, we hadn't looked at that. It's like everybody loves food. Well, no,
Yeah,
everybody doesn't love their portion of the food part, and we're just a portion of that part. But trying to get everybody to work together and working as a community, you have to look at the draws and the pullbacks that they have. And we hadn't been looking at the pullbacks.
yeah, that's great. Thanks. Some others. What unique things did you experience? And how does it apply to your work?
Think unique, yeah, unique is that everybody was pretty excited about getting like food system initiatives going
Mhm,
and recognize the need, but no one was willing or had the
mhm,
capacity to take it on
mhm.
and kind of steward that.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, that happened over and over and over. Um, so that's unique. I'll put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Angelica. Yeah, unique. Unique is the world right now that we're in with those of us in the food space. Food is a great unifier and it's very unique to be in that space as advocacy and work right now. Yeah. Let's get a couple more voices on this one. What did you experience? And how does it apply to your work? Or throw it in the chat if you're capable. We can put some eyes on the chat.
I could share one that stood out to me and that I noticed in the group as well. What we heard back was around the speaking to loss part.
Mm, mhm,
And what I took too is important for a leader to listen to loss. And what's happening right now, in food systems work, there's a lot of loss in terms of like program cuts and budget cuts. And so creating space for that, for people to discuss that before moving on. And just how you both presented so well about the benefits of that, how that opens up a communication flow. Whereas if people aren't permitted to speak to loss, or if it's cut off, then um, it kind of stifles things there. So just that helps people to get through the process. And there's just more need for that now because of all the cuts that have happened.
yeah, it might be an act of leadership to open up a space to speak to loss and not to presume to know what loss is for others or other stakeholder groups, but to just ask the powerful question, what might you lose in this? What do you stand to lose in this? And just open that conversation. as Andrew said, it's often not spoke about in a lot of sectors of our world, but the importance of it connected to food work and ability to just open that up might be an act of leadership. So were there any tools or resources that are now available to you that you even have found yourself using? Anyone specifically? We heard faction mapping, Carrie shared. Any others?
I'm not exactly sure what faction mapping is, but I've definitely used like landscape analysis, asset mapping, um, different qualitative assessments. Um, yeah, I think John Hopkins has like a lot of great resources in their database too. Yeah.
Great.
And Tina,
Anyone
we've got
else?
a question in the chat box about how long does faction mapping take?
Oh, great question. Faction mapping is an ongoing. It is not a finite, it's not a finite, it's done. It's the idea of looking through a lens of the values, the loyalties, what might this stakeholder group, stand to lose. It's an engagement tool to look at those you're working with, how you're communicating with them, and it should grow. It should be exponential. Similar to some tools, it's presented on a page, but it should be a mindset of whom do I need to engage in this work? Where are they at? And then considering what their values and their loyalties and their losses might be. Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Very
a
good
really,
tool and it never ends. Go ahead.
yeah, that's a really good explanation. And I agree with Kisa that I think I consistently do that a lot. Um, I work at an innovation nonprofit, and so we focus in user-centered design and the innovation model. And that
Nice.
sounds, just like it. You are repeatedly cycling through different stages to kind of see, what works next. So thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a reiterative. It's a continue ongoing. I say we can faction map on a map. We can faction map in a car, just talking. It's a consideration of those that we're engaging and a deeper understanding. To Carrie's point, it's a deeper look of the depth of that stakeholder group. Yeah.
And to pick up on this conversation, Tina, I think it depends on how you are approaching faction mapping. Is this something like was said in the chat box that you're just kind of going through mentally, maybe even in between meetings? Or are you making this an all out like strategic workshop that you are conducting with some of your project teammates, or have you expanded it to the entire community? So then it becomes very difficult to say if you're doing this not as a one-time thing, but like here's an isolated day or time that we're doing this, knowing that yes, it is continuous. How large is the group that you're working with? And for what purpose are you doing it? Are you trying to build it into a strategy, a communications plan, or is there like a very specific issue that you're trying to address? So you're grabbing a couple of people to brainstorm with. I mean, this could go from being a 30-minute activity to
Right.
an entire day-long workshop or a series.
Absolutely. You nailed it, Kalia. The method in which you're utilizing something like a faction map, in what context, right? In what context? Yeah, it could be a one-on-one conversation as we're starting planning. It could be a community-led day workshop. It could be a retreat. In what context we're using it. The idea is a deeper lens of looking at those stakeholder groups and how we can communicate with them. Yeah. And I'm going to skip over this next one, looking specifically at the course, because I want to look at this last question, right? We covered in the course through entirety really an analysis of power dynamics, bias, and communication in our work. And I'm just curious, what's the significance of these themes in our work? as food system practitioners, as we're building ecosystem, what are the significance, these power dynamics that we experience, maybe often unspoken, formal, informal, biases in our communication in our work? What are your thoughts on that? Is this idea of distinguishing the elements of our work, the elements of our projects, our work, our teams that are technical and those that are adaptive. We know our leadership work, exercising leadership when it's an activity is a verb, it's happening in this adaptive space. This is where our time and effort is spent. And as Kalia said, just naming an elephant in the room doesn't mean we brought the elephant. It's always been there. Might be an adaptive element to start diving into that conversation. Technical work, the elements of what we do that are technical. It's when we have an issue, we have a situation or a problem, dare say. It's very clear, it's very known. This isn't technical in the digital age, technological computer sense. This is, what about this is known? It's fixable. I know that I can hire someone, we can put some money at it, and the expectation is it's going to be solved. All right. And our attitude around technical work is certainty. Okay. It says being right, but it's certain. I hold a mindset that this is certain. We know we have a project and it's going to need 2 new employees, and we could probably get that by with 5 volunteers. So I need some budget and some dollars, and it's very technical. When you look at your work and you start diagnosing it, and you look at the processes, and you look at some power dynamics, and we look at why we're doing what we're doing, the elements of this that we call adaptive are going to be unclear. Meaning, what's the problem? If I were to elevate what is the issue, and we all say it's a different issue, it's going to require some learning. We have an unclear situation, an unclear problem at the core of this. It's going to require us to learn some things and engage others, stakeholders in faction work. It requires us to engage them, and all through a mindset of being curious. Powerful questions. Sheila, I teach appreciative inquiry. Absolutely. I teach a semester of it. It's really important because we're rooting our minds in curiosity. I don't have the problem. I don't presume to know what the situation fixes could be, but I'm holding a curiosity and asking more questions, right? I'm pulling back layers to diagnose access, resources, power, biases, communication, right? These are pieces of our work that are adaptive. And distinguishing between them can help us on some communication. And I want to leave you with this. Technical work lives in our head. So if you're thinking in logic and reason, you're in a technical space, all right? And the issue in our society is really good about putting technical fixes over adaptive challenges. Okay, it looks like quick fixes to generational situations, circular conversations, because adaptive work lives in our heart. It's the stuff that's visceral. It's the stuff that's been here for generations. It's the stuff that's the elephant in the room, and we don't need to call it the elephant because it's been there. It's going to require a lot of stakeholders' eyes on it. And the timeline on this work, it's long term. That's why Clea and I said we started this course with we are working in generational impact in 3 to 5 year increments. 3 to 5 year increments kind of fund us in a technical way. But adaptive communal change is for the long game. And that's a heart space because we are rooted in values and loyalties and experiencing loss. It's another word for our trauma. Values and loyalties and losses live in the adaptive space. So we have to be intentional about doing work in that space. Okay, so distinguishing what's technical and adaptive could be a way to ground some communication and conversation. Here's a tool, but we just want to jump into an activity. Okay, a real quick activity, and we're going to call this, we're going to give an image, right? This is something you can do with your teams. This is a great tool through this idea of appreciative inquiry. I love that, Sheila, you brought that. And lean in on the adaptive side. We don't know the problem. We don't know what the fix could be. We don't know what the engagement is. We have to get curious about it. And a way of being curious is offering interpretations, making sense of what we see, right? So we're going to practice this all together. Grab an image. And let's just put our eyes on it. Before we jump into the conversation, we need to understand as humans, we see and experience things and we instantaneously make sense of them, right? In the 90s, we used to call this diagnosing body language. Well, if you cross your arms, it means this, right? But if we get really curious about what that means, right? If you have this with your body language, it means this. Well, it could mean something else. So when we see things, we tell ourselves an instant story. And slowing down to unpack those stories and offer multiple interpretations might yield us some different communication. So as we look at this picture, what are you seeing? What are you curious about? And I have some specific questions with this to help us guide the work. But just notice what you're thinking from what you see. The buildings, barriers, what types of barriers, the materials, shirts, what do you see on the shirts? Even down to this brown paper sack, what could be in it? Is it removal? Is it added? Why is that bagged by this individual? Our mind is curious from we see and experience. And so in adaptive leadership, we make these interpretations. What are interpretations we can offer about this scenario? So we'll start with the first few. What are some interpretations regarding what we presume to be volunteers, staff, this neighborhood? What do you think? We want to close out, our time together with how do we do this work, folks, going forward? What do you think, Clea?
So I'm going to ask you guys to drop just a one-word response in the chat box about how did it feel sitting in this activity that we just went through? Let me give you just a second. And as soon as it comes to mind, don't think too hard about it. What are you thinking? Drop it in the chat box. Okay. Eye-opening, varied, options, diagnostic, creative, hidden picture. Okay, keep going.
Great.
Investigative. Made me realize pausing and listening is really important. Can be uncomfortable to share our interpretations.
Sure. Thank you for reading those too, Clea. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And please keep dropping some responses in here, but I want to say for every response that has been dropped in the chat box right now. So look, we've got about 27 people in this room and maybe about 10 responses. In any room that you're going into, in any community that's based on any project, you will have people thinking these kind of things. And equally, if we've got 10 people that have responded, another 17 that aren't saying anything at all. Now, what I'm saying is, how does that fit into the way that we manage a project? How does that fit into this diagnosis with how quickly we go to developing the solutions and just getting to the project versus sitting in the diagnosis that is ultimately going to lead to this whole plan that gets laid out? So there were some interpretations and questions about how involved was the community. So, who is being served by any project? We've got here in the chat box too, we may have our own biases. Exactly.
Right.
And there are different reasons why we are engaging at different points or not engaging at different points. Silence is sometimes consent, silence is sometimes not consent. It's hard to say. So starting at the beginning with sitting in the diagnosis to launch the whole effort is really important. And it just brings up the question of what do we give attention to in our projects and why as we're planning them? So this idea of how do we do this work going forward really is, yes, there's the technical components of our project. And then what are the social, emotional impacts of those things? Because we really are, whether or not they are said explicitly, led by our values and how they show up in spaces. And that may be through our engagement, that may be through decisions that we make, that may be in terms of interest or disinterest. So how do we create more of that container or that space to get very curious about all of that and dig deep? Give it back
Yeah,
over to you, Tina.
yeah, Kalia leads us to this final note of going back to the beginning and this diagnosis. What do you need to do a deeper cultivating dive? To go beyond what's seen, to go beyond the technical of managing the work. But what do you need to do for yourself, with your communications, with your groups, to go and do a deeper cultivating dive through this project management leadership? And I'd love for you, as Clea said, drop it in the chat. Thoughts on the introspection of what you need, the technical, what you actually need in terms of maybe some tools or resources, but what do you need to go into a deeper cultivating understanding for your project management leadership? And if anyone would be vulnerable and share, would love to hear your voice. But what is it that you need? Let's get one or two. I'd love to note this out with one or two. Talking through what do we need to go into a deeper dive for ourselves.
There's a comment here in the chat box I want to bring up here, Tina. I think the silence of some can be because we as a group haven't gelled together yet.
Okay, absolutely. Sheila.
I decided it was easier to raise my hand than try to
Right. Yeah, just talk.
I just one of the things I'm realizing as we're going through this that would be really helpful is I co-lead with other people. You know, there's multiple leaders in our group, and each of us has our own style and also has our own limitations in terms of, like, one person wants to send out a mass email to everybody and then have everybody fill out a form. And other people like me tend to get on the phone and want to talk with each person. And there's like this balance that you have to strike. And so I don't like, maybe you just have to make it up as you go. But like, I'm finding this helpful to be able to communicate to the others on my team as to why I advocate for more contact early on in order to build efficiency later. But I also totally understand like who has time all the time to make 25 phone calls and talk with people or whatever it might be. So I don't know, any tools you have around that would be super helpful.
Yeah, I hear you articulating your purpose. You can have a you purpose. Sheila's purpose is this. Yeah, my purpose for doing this type of engagement and communication, and here's my why. It's great. Yeah. Anybody else? What do you need to go to a deeper dive? Let's get one more in here before we close out. Or dump it in the chat. Because I would argue to speak our needs, we can do that. I can speak our needs. If we have a learning need, if we have a curiosity to go deeper into this work, then that's ours. And that's valid and real.
In the chat, there's more tools and leadership communication strategies. A note that support from the community is imperative and outreach strategies and people for this is important.
Yeah, I appreciate a note from the neighborhood. That speaks to my heart. That resonates from my heart. Okay. With that, I'm going to close out our time together from our end, and we'll turn it back over to Emma and Andrew. But please know your capacity, folks, in any variety of any effort and scale, it's critically, it's precisely what the world needs right now. So as we all continue to do the big lift together, thank you so much. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Andrew, Emma.
Yes, thank you guys so much. Thank you, Kalia and Tina. That was awesome to close out this 3-part, now 4-part series. I'm just going to say a couple things as we head out that we're taking next month off from Community of Practice because IICD is doing a large food systems conference in Portland, Oregon. So I'm really excited that people